What happens when one of television's most respected journalists decides he's had enough of celebrity spin and goes head-to-head with royalty gone rogue? You're about to witness one of the most uncomfortable television moments ever captured, where preparation meets desperation and years of media training crumble under the weight of hard-hitting questions. This is the story of how George Stephanopoulos systematically dismantled Meghan Markle's carefully constructed narrative on live television. And trust me, you won't believe how this plays out. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about celebrity accountability in the media. The Good Morning America studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy, but there was something different in the air that morning. George Stephanopoulos sat at his desk, reviewing his notes one final time. His research team had spent weeks preparing for this interview, and unlike the usual softball questions that celebrities had grown accustomed to, George had something else in mind entirely. Meghan Markle entered the studio with her typical confidence, flanked by her publicist and a small entourage. She was impeccably dressed, her media-trained smile firmly in place as she made her way to the interview chair. The cameras weren't rolling yet, but she was already performing, greeting the crew with practiced warmth. "Meghan, thank you for joining us this morning," George said as she settled into her chair, the makeup team making final touch-ups. "I hope you're ready for an honest conversation." "Of course, George. I'm always ready to share my truth," she replied, that familiar phrase rolling off her tongue with rehearsed precision. The red light came on. They were live. "Good morning. I'm George Stephanopoulos, and we're here with Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, philanthropist and podcaster." "Meghan, you've been making headlines recently with some pretty serious allegations about your time in the royal family. Let's start with something that's been bothering me, and I think a lot of our viewers. You've spoken extensively about feeling silenced and voiceless during your time as a working royal, yet you had access to some of the most powerful media platforms in the world. Can you help me understand how someone with your level of access and influence could feel truly voiceless?" The question hit differently than Meghan had expected. She had prepared for the usual questions about mental health and racism, but George was approaching this from an angle that immediately put her on the defensive. "Well, George, I think there's a difference between having a platform and being allowed to use your authentic voice. Yes, I had access to certain opportunities, but everything I said and did was heavily controlled and monitored. I wasn't allowed to speak freely about issues that mattered to me." "But Meghan, let's be specific here. You were allowed to champion causes like women's education, you traveled the world representing the Commonwealth, you had your own royal patronages. These aren't exactly the conditions of someone who's been silenced. In fact, millions of people would consider those extraordinary privileges." George's tone remained professional, but there was an edge to his questioning that was clearly catching Meghan off guard. She shifted slightly in her chair, her media-trained composure beginning to show hairline cracks. "I understand how it might appear from the outside, but you have to understand the context. Yes, I had those opportunities, but they came with incredible restrictions. I couldn't speak about issues that were important to me personally. Everything had to fit within very narrow parameters." "Let's talk about those parameters then. You mentioned in previous interviews that you were told not to speak to the press, that you weren't protected by the institution. But isn't it standard protocol for working royals to have their media interactions coordinated through official channels? Prince William, Prince Catherine, they all follow the same guidelines, don't they? It's different when you're coming from the outside, George. I didn't grow up in this system. I had a voice before I joined the family, and suddenly I was expected to just disappear into this institution." "But you knew what you were signing up for, didn't you? This isn't exactly a secret. The royal family's approach to media has been consistent for decades. Did you expect them to change centuries of protocol for your specific situation?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Meghan's practiced smile was beginning to fade, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like irritation. "I think any reasonable person would expect some level of support and protection when they're facing unprecedented levels of scrutiny and harassment. I was dealing with things that other members of the family simply hadn't experienced." "Unprecedented scrutiny?" "Meghan, with respect, Princess Diana faced intense media scrutiny, as did Sarah Ferguson, Sophie Wessex, when she married into the family. The British press has always been notoriously tough on royal family members, particularly the women who marry into the family. What made your situation so uniquely challenging?" George was methodically building his case, and viewers could see Meghan becoming increasingly uncomfortable with each question. Her body language was shifting, her responses becoming more defensive. The difference, George, and I think this is important to acknowledge, is the racial element. The coverage I received had undertones and sometimes overtones that were clearly racially motivated. That's not something the other women you mentioned had to deal with. That's a serious allegation, and racism is certainly something we should address when it exists. But can you point to specific examples of mainstream media outlets publishing content that was racially motivated, rather than just standard tabloid sensationalism? I think if you look at the language that was used, the way stories were framed, especially compared to how similar actions by other royal family members were covered, the pattern becomes clear. I've actually had my team do exactly that analysis, Meghan. We pulled dozens of headlines about you and compared them to similar coverage of other royal family members. While the tabloids were certainly harsh, and that's their standard operating procedure, the actual content of the criticism seemed to focus on your actions and statements rather than your race. In fact, many of the same publications that were critical of you have been equally harsh with other royals over the years. Can you point to a specific headline or article that you believe crossed the line into racism? The question was delivered with George's trademark calm professionalism, but it was devastating in its specificity. Meghan had clearly not expected to be challenged so directly on what had become one of her core talking points. Meghan paused for what felt like an eternity, her carefully constructed media persona beginning to crack under the weight of George's relentless preparation. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she searched for a response that wouldn't further damage her position. George, I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation. Racism isn't always about explicit language. It's about subtext. It's about the way stories are positioned, the choice of photographs, the overall narrative that's being constructed. I understand that racism can be subtle, Meghan, but when you make such serious allegations, don't you think you have a responsibility to provide concrete evidence? You're essentially accusing some of Britain's largest media organizations of institutional racism. That's not a small claim. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm simply sharing my lived experience and how the coverage made me feel. George leaned forward slightly, his expression remaining neutral, but his tone sharpening with surgical precision. But feelings and facts are two different things, aren't they? You've built much of your public narrative around the idea that you were uniquely mistreated by the British press because of your race. If that's not supported by the actual evidence, doesn't that undermine your credibility on other issues? The question hit its mark. Meghan's composure was visibly wavering now, her hands fidgeting with her jewelry as she struggled to regain control of the narrative. I think what's happening right now is a perfect example of what I experienced. I'm being questioned and challenged in ways that other people simply aren't. When I share my truth, I'm immediately met with demands for proof and evidence, as if my lived experience isn't valid. Meghan, with respect, this is journalism. When anyone makes serious public allegations, they should expect to be asked for supporting evidence. This isn't personal, it's professional. You've chosen to be a public figure making public claims. Scrutiny comes with that territory, but the level of scrutiny I face is disproportionate, George. You've spent more time in the last 5 minutes questioning my experiences than most interviewers spend on entire segments with other public figures. George's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was far from finished. Let's talk about proportionality then. You and your husband stepped away from your royal duties, citing media intrusion and lack of support. But since leaving, you've done multiple high-profile interviews, started a podcast, signed lucrative deals with streaming services, written books. If you wanted privacy and to escape media attention, don't these actions seem contradictory? We wanted to control our own narrative instead of having it controlled for us. There's a difference between choosing when and how to engage with media and having every aspect of your life dissected without your consent. But Meghan, you're a public figure married to a member of the British royal family. Surely you understood that privacy would be limited. And more importantly, you're now making money from sharing the very stories you once wanted to keep private. How do you reconcile that? The question was delivered with devastating calm, and Meghan's response revealed just how unprepared she was for this level of direct challenge. I think you're mischaracterizing our situation. We're using our platform to shed light on important issues and to correct misinformation that's been spread about us. Correct misinformation? Let's examine that. In your interview with Oprah, you made several claims that were later disputed or clarified. You said you were married 3 days before your public wedding, but the Archbishop of Canterbury later clarified that wasn't legally accurate. You suggested you had little knowledge of the royal family before marrying Harry, but there's evidence of your interest in Princess Diana and royal affairs going back years. When your claims are later contradicted by official sources, doesn't that raise questions about reliability? Meghan's face flushed slightly, and for the first time in the interview, her voice carried a note of genuine anger rather than practiced victimhood. I think it's incredibly unfair to nitpick specific details when the broader truth of what we experience remains valid. You're focusing on technicalities instead of the substance of our concerns. Technicalities? Meghan, accuracy matters, especially when you're making allegations that could damage reputations and institutions. If you're incorrect about verifiable facts, how can viewers trust your claims about things that can't be verified? I stand by everything I've said. Our experiences were real, our concerns were legitimate, and the lack of support we received was devastating. George consulted his notes briefly, and when he looked up, there was something in his expression that suggested the conversation was about to take an even more uncomfortable turn. Let's talk about support then. You've mentioned repeatedly that you didn't receive adequate support for your mental health struggles. But isn't it true that you were offered resources through the Royal Household's employee assistance programs? And didn't you have access to private health care through your position? The support that was offered wasn't appropriate for someone in my unique situation. I needed specialized help, and the options presented to me weren't sufficient. But Meghan, you and Harry had the financial means to seek private care. You had access to the best medical professionals in the world. If the support offered through official channels wasn't adequate, why didn't you simply arrange private care? Many people facing mental health challenges don't have those options. The question exposed what many viewers were probably thinking but were afraid to voice. Meghan's response revealed just how out of touch her complaints could sound to ordinary people. It's not that simple when you're in that situation. Everything has to be approved. Everything has protocols. I couldn't just make appointments without permission. Permission from whom exactly? Are you saying that as a grown woman, you were prevented from seeking medical care? Because if that's true, that would be a very serious allegation. But if it's not true, then you're essentially complaining about having to follow the same coordination procedures that any high-profile person would need to follow for security and scheduling purposes. Meghan was clearly struggling now, caught between wanting to maintain her victim narrative and avoiding making claims that could be easily disproven. You're oversimplifying an incredibly complex and painful situation, George. The constraints I was under were real, even if they might not make sense to people on the outside. Help me understand then. Give me a specific example of how you were prevented from getting the help you needed. Because right now, it sounds like you had access to resources that most people could only dream of, but you're presenting it as if you were somehow trapped or abandoned. The studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of cameras. Meghan looked directly at George, and for a moment, the mask of victimhood slipped entirely, replaced by something that looked very much like barely contained fury. The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in live television. Meghan's eyes narrowed as she stared at George, her mask of composed victimhood completely shattered. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a venom that shocked viewers who had grown accustomed to her practiced vulnerability. You know what, George? This is exactly the problem. I come here in good faith to share my story, and you sit there with your research team's little fact checks, trying to tear apart everything I say. This is the same energy that drove us out of the UK in the first place. George's expression remained neutral, but there was something almost surgical in his response. Meghan, I'm simply asking you to support your claims with evidence. That's not an attack, that's journalism. You've made very serious allegations about racism and institutional failures. Don't you think those deserve scrutiny? Scrutiny? Meghan's voice cracked slightly, revealing genuine anger beneath the surface. Is that what you call this interrogation? You've spent this entire interview trying to discredit me, questioning my mental health struggles, dismissing my experiences with racism, picking apart every detail of my story. This isn't scrutiny. This is character assassination. Character assassination would be making unfounded personal attacks. What I'm doing is asking you to provide specifics for your public claims. There's a significant difference. You've accused the royal family of having concerns about your child's skin color. That's an explosive allegation that has damaged relationships and institutions. Yet you refuse to provide any details that could be verified or contextualized. How is that fair to the people you're accusing? Meghan leaned forward, her composure completely gone now, her voice rising with each word. Fair? You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when I was suicidal and told I couldn't get help because it wouldn't look good for the institution? Was it fair when newspapers printed lies about me day after day while the palace did nothing to correct the record? Was it fair when I was 5 months pregnant and being attacked in the media while getting zero support from the people who were supposed to protect me? George didn't flinch at her emotional outburst. Instead, he leaned back slightly and delivered what would become the most devastating question of the interview. Meghan, you keep saying you were told you couldn't get help, but I have to ask, who specifically told you that? Because according to our research, working royals have access to comprehensive health care, including mental health services. The Heads Together campaign, which William, Catherine, and Harry championed, specifically focused on removing stigma from mental health treatment. So, I'm confused about who exactly prevented you from accessing care. The question hit like a physical blow. Meghan's mouth opened and closed several times before she could formulate a response, and when she did, it was clear she was scrambling. It's not about official policies, George. It's about the culture, the environment, the pressure not to make waves. You wouldn't understand because you've never been in that position. Actually, Meghan, I've covered mental health issues extensively, and I've interviewed many people who've struggled with these challenges. What I've never encountered is someone with your resources and connections claiming they couldn't access help. You had a personal fortune, connections throughout the entertainment industry, access to the best medical care in the world. Are you really telling our viewers that with all of those advantages, you were somehow trapped and helpless? The question exposed the fundamental weakness in Meghan's narrative. She was asking people to believe that one of the most privileged individuals on the planet was somehow powerless to help herself. You're twisting everything I'm saying, she snapped. This is exactly the kind of gaslighting I experienced in the royal family. Nothing I say is ever good enough. Every explanation gets picked apart and questioned. Gaslighting is making someone question their own reality by denying or distorting facts. What I'm doing is asking you to provide facts to support your version of reality. Those are opposite things. And frankly, Meghan, accusing me of gaslighting for doing basic journalism is exactly the kind of deflection that makes people question your credibility in the first place. George's calm dissection of her accusations was clearly infuriating Meghan. She was used to interviewers who accepted her narratives without challenge, who treated her claims with reverent sympathy. George was treating her like any other public figure, making serious accusations, and she clearly couldn't handle it. I don't have to sit here and be psychoanalyzed by someone who's never walked in my shoes, she said, her voice now shaking with rage. I know what I experienced. I know what was said to me. I know how I was treated, and I don't need to prove any of that to you or anyone else. But you do, actually. You've made these experiences the foundation of your public brand. You've written books about them, done interviews about them, signed deals worth millions based on these stories. When you monetize your trauma, it stops being personal testimony and becomes a product, and products should be held to standards of accuracy and truth. The observation was brutal in its clarity. George had just articulated what many people had been thinking but hadn't been able to express. Meghan had turned her grievances into a business model, and that changed the rules of engagement entirely. How dare you reduce my pain to a business model, she hissed, her carefully cultivated image now completely destroyed. How dare you suggest that sharing my story is somehow calculated or opportunistic? I've been through hell, and all you can do is question whether I'm profiting from it. I'm not questioning whether you're profiting from it, Meghan. That's obvious. You are profiting from it significantly. What I'm questioning is whether the story you're selling matches the reality of what actually happened. Because the more we examine your claims, the more inconsistencies emerge. George consulted his notes one final time, and when he looked up, there was something in his expression that suggested he was about to deliver the killing blow. Let me ask you one final question, Meghan. Given everything we've discussed today, given the contradictions and inconsistencies that have emerged, given your inability to provide specific evidence for your most serious allegations, do you understand why some people might view your story with skepticism? Do you understand why they might see you not as a victim, but as someone who has weaponized the language of victimhood for personal and financial gain? The question hung in the studio air like a death sentence. Meghan stared at George with pure hatred, her mouth working soundlessly as she struggled to formulate any response that wouldn't further confirm his devastating assessment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was filled with a rage that was absolutely chilling. This interview is over. She ripped off her microphone and stormed off the set, leaving George sitting calmly at his desk as the cameras continued rolling. He waited a moment, then looked directly into the camera with the same professional composure he'd maintained throughout the entire devastating encounter. We'll be right back after this break. And there you have it, folks. One of the most brutal takedowns in television history, where careful preparation met manufactured victimhood and exposed it for exactly what it was. What do you think? Did George cross a line? Or did he do exactly what journalists should do when public figures make serious accusations? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more explosive interviews that reveal the truth behind the carefully crafted celebrity narratives.